digital archivist at the San Diego Air and Space Museum. I've been with the museum coming up on over 20 years now. And I'm going to talk about the history of aviation in San Diego. What you'll see is going to be all the images presented in this slideshow are going to be from the San Diego Air and Space Museum archives. And just so you are aware, you can see the mission of the library and archives there. So it makes sense that all these images would be cared for by us and really highlight the history of San Diego. We do look at aerospace history from all over the world, but we have a special place in our heart for the history of the local area that we're from. So when you talk about the history of San Diego, the history of aviation is really intertwined for over 100 years. And many locals will probably be familiar with some of these names, and even people from out of the area. Many aviation firsts occurred in the area, possibly more than any other area in the world. Certainly in America, just some things that stand out that we'll be covering. Curtis Flying School on North Island and how that led to the beginning of naval aviation. Consolidated Aircraft Corporation, Ryan Aircraft Company, Pacific Southwest Airlines. And one thing that is kind of a theme is that aviation really contributed to the growth of the region. And, you can't say what would have happened if such and such didn't happen, but certainly without aviation in San Diego, the region would be much different and the history wouldn't be as rich and the growth that aviation brought wouldn't be so dramatic. So we could look at the early years, and this is really the period prior to World War I. And we could even go back even further. I love this image because it shows Hotel del Coronado, which is obviously still around, and a Curtiss pusher flying on the beach. And I love the caption, "Too many shutterbugs and stand strollers for landing in this area." So they had to abort the landing. But this just kind of gives you an idea of the quality of images we have, with a lot of notes, really rare images, and really could tell a very detailed and intimate story about the history of aviation in San Diego. So the history of aviation in San Diego really starts with John Montgomery in Otay Mesa. Now, he had been doing glider experiments, and at the time, obviously, cameras weren't as widely available. He worked alone most of the time. But in 1883, and that's 20 years before the Wright brothers, he made the first controlled flight in the Western Hemisphere in Otay Mesa. There was no other witness to it. He did write about it. And he was not the type of man that was out for fame. He was much more interested in the science of it. So it wouldn't be one of these things that he would exaggerate. So for all intents and purposes, we really do believe that he was the first person to make a controlled flight, although not a powered flight, a glider flight in the Western Hemisphere. And he continued to do glider experiments. He eventually moved up to Northern California, and he would die in 1911 near San Jose in a more advanced glider experiment. But all the way back in 1883, the region, he was doing experiments and gliding way before the Wright brothers. And although it was not well known about, it definitely had a big impact on the history of aviation. And some of the lessons he learned were handed down to the next generation's experimenters. So time would pass. We know about the Wright brothers flying in 1903, And really for the next several years, flight was in its infancy, but it came back to San Diego in 1910 with the Coronado Air Meet. And this was when a few aviators went to Coronado on the polo grounds there and just did some experimental flying. And the first verified flight of a powered airplane occurred at this Coronado Air Meet in 1910. There is a record reported by Donald Gordon himself that there was a small flight that he made on his own airplane in 1909. Probably happened, but there's no witnesses, and really wasn't as long as the sustained flights from the Coronado Air Meet. But this was the first time people in San Diego got to see the excitement of aviation. And it was attended by thousands on Coronado Island. And it was fitting that it was on Coronado, as North Island would become known as the birthplace of naval aviation. Now, if you're familiar with Coronado now, it looks like one island. It wasn't quite that way at this time. You had Coronado itself, and then you had North Island, which was separated by a large area of water. So there are actually two islands that now make up what we consider Coronado. And so what we're going to talk about happening with this was actually occurred on North Island. And what occurred was Glenn Curtiss had been doing experiments back east, and he realized that he could do a lot more all year round if he came out and enjoyed the beautiful weather in the San Diego area. One of the things he was interested in was taking off from the water, and obviously he couldn't do that in the frozen lakes of New York during January. So he said, well, I will come out to North Island. I'll start my experiments. I'll start training pilots. And he invited the Navy, and he said he would train their pilots. And the first person to take him up on them was Theodore Spuds Ellison, who would become known as Naval Aviator number 1. And he first took off and flew in early 1911. And really, you could kind of tell how successful Curtiss was with his experiments is that the Navy bought in, and they purchased one of his designs, the A1 Triad, which the San Diego Air and Space Museum has a flying copy of, a reproduction of in our museum. And in 1911, in May, the Navy bought one of Curtiss's triads, and this is considered the start of naval aviation. And obviously, from this time to the present day, the Navy and naval aviation is such a large part of San Diego, definitely intertwined. All you have to do is look across the bay to North Island, and you can't miss what's going on there. But this is, over 110-year legacy that's been going on. Now, Glenn Curtiss didn't just limit himself to military training. Curtiss also trained aspiring pilots from all over the world. Portuguese pilots, some Japanese pilots were students of his. And we'll see that San Diego and aviation was not just a man's undertaking. Even as far back as Curtiss, women were involved, such as Julia Clark learned how to fly under Curtiss. And as we talk about the history of aviation in San Diego, you'll see that women were involved as well in many different aspects. And this went back to the time of Curtiss. And he was willing to train anyone who was brave enough and bold enough to take the pilot seat. And you have to realize at this time, flying is very, very dangerous, especially with the Curtiss aircraft. As you can see in that one picture there, the engines are behind the pilot. And what would often happen in a crack up is that when the airplane would crash, even if it wasn't going too fast, one big danger with the Curtiss airplanes was that engine that was behind him could end up landing on him and injuring him very, very badly, or possibly killing him. So it wasn't just a slight undertaking to want to get on, take to the skies and fly. So North Island, it's today known as a naval base, but at the start, it actually was divided between the Army, who opened a training field in 1912, and then the Navy, who were there originally early, but then in 1917 officially opened North Island Naval Air Station. And you could see this map. It does a really good job of showing the line between the Naval Air Station and Rockwell Field. You could see that what would be the southern end of the island would be Rockwell Field. That would be the side that is now closer to what is Coronado and where Hotel Del is. And then the Naval Air Station is on the northern point there. Rockwell, the Rockwell Field trained soldiers, or excuse me, Air Corps pilots during World War I. And not only were early aircraft involved, but a lot of early airship traffic was on the island as well. And there was large airship hangar on there as well. So really, from the time right after Curtiss, North Island has had a military presence. The Army would eventually leave Rockwell Field, but the Navy had a strong presence there ever since. And you could see after World War I on the left here, there was a flyover of hundreds, I think it was like 110 aircraft, I don't know the exact number, from Rockwell Field that flew over San Diego to celebrate the end of World War I. As I mentioned, women were definitely involved from the get-go. And a famous parachutist was Georgia Tiny, was her nickname because she was small, Broadwick. And she did the first parachute jump in California, all way back in 1913. She was a performer, one of the early daredevils, and she would perform jumping out of airplanes when this was something that was very novel. Catherine Stinson in 1915, over the California Pacific exhibition, performed several times, and she actually looped the loop. Way back in 1915, and really thrilled the onlookers fair there over Balboa Park. And one of her things is that she would drop flowers on the onlookers as kind of a signature move. The 1920s and 1930s is often considered the golden age of aviation. And certainly that would be no different for San Diego. And really, San Diego in this golden age, we'll see that aviation really led to not only the notoriety, but the growth of the region. And like much of the country, the barnstormer phenomenon took off. And this was when often pilots coming back from the First World War would perform daredevil stunts of different types. And one of the local favorites was Clyde Pangborn, who would go from a car to an airplane, both of them moving. And luckily there was a photographer on hand when he attempted this on Coronado, on the beach in Coronado, and he actually fell, but he was injured, but was okay. Another local aviator tried to do the same thing and were successful by going from a boat to an airplane. So, like most of the country, the barnstorm phenomenon had taken grip in California and in San Diego. And unlike a lot of the country, we had the military presence here where a lot of experiments would occur. And again, a lot of this had to do with the region's great weather. But because the technology, the weather, and the pilots who were able to perform these tasks, San Diego had many firsts, and a couple very notable firsts are the first aerial refueling occurred in June of 1923. So 2 Army aircraft flew above the city of San Diego and were able to use a hose and refuel. It was quite a sight. And Lieutenants McReady and Kelly in May of 1923 landed in California, in San Diego, at Rockwell Field after the first nonstop transcontinental crossing of America in that aircraft you see there. And the first carrier, the USS Langley, was often home ported here in San Diego at North Island. And it was really the start of this tradition of having San Diego be known as a carrier base and an optimum one. And moving on, we could discuss one of the first real aerospace manufacturers in the area, and that would be Ryan. And his story is pretty impressive because he started off with a dream and pursued it pretty much throughout his life. And he started off pretty much as a barnstormer himself. He started offering flights for, just a few dollars at the foot of the Broadway Pier, kind of where the train station is now. You could see that area from the image in the upper left has really changed a lot. But at the time, there was a field there, and you could land in that area. So starting in 1922, T. Claude Ryan started offering flights, just sightseeing flights around San Diego for a few minutes from there. And in 1925, he started an airline, and this airline flew from San Diego to Los Angeles and back again. He modified some aircraft, a standard J1 and this one here that you see, and offered scheduled flights daily from San Diego to Los Angeles and back again. So he would be involved in both an airline and producing aircraft. He started with a simple aircraft called the M1, which was actually a mail plane. And his company would continue on, and we'll talk about the Spirit of St. Louis in a second. It's kind of interesting to note, you have to follow Ryan's career. He actually started the company. He sold the company right prior to when Lindbergh would come, and the company built the Spirit of St. Louis. At that time, T. Claude Ryan was not officially an owner. There were some reports of him having some involvement and being around the company, but not in an official capacity. And then his partner Mahoney took over at the time that the Spirit of St. Louis was built, but they kept the Ryan name. So there's some confusion about that. Mahoney would eventually stop that company, and Ryan would start up Ryan Aeronautical again in the 1930s. It's a little bit confusing, but T. Claude Ryan always was a mainstay of the San Diego aviation scene. So like I mentioned, by the time T. Claude Ryan sold the company, that's when Lindbergh heard about the success of the M1 mail plane, and he came to San Diego and asked if the Ryan Company could build an aircraft that was capable of flying across the Atlantic nonstop to win the Orteig Prize, which was a prize that would be given to the first person who did that solo. And so Donald Hall was the chief engineer at Ryan at the time. Him and Lindbergh sat down and decided that they could do that. And that's when they designed the famous Spirit of St. Louis, using some of the basics of the Ryan M1, but made a lot of changes to it. As you could see, it didn't have a front windshield to make room for a much larger fuel capacity. And in fact, it had a periscope situation where Lindbergh would had to look out and be able to see the front of the aircraft. But in very short order, in just a couple months, they were able to build the Spirit of St. Louis, test it, and on May 20th, Lindbergh took off from New York, and on the 21st, he landed in Paris in probably the most famous flight ever. And he became an instant celebrity. And San Diego gained a lot of notoriety from that as well. The aircraft was built here. It was tested here. It was built in an area close to the where the airport is now, and then tested at an area called Dutch Flats, which is kind of in the Midway district now. Everything's changed so much, it's hard to get the exact location. We used to say it was right by the old post office that was over there, but that's gone now. But what ended up happening was that with aviation, with Lindbergh completing that flight, that solo flight, it's hard for us to imagine, but he instantly became probably the most famous person in the world. He was a celebrity. He toured all over America. He did a goodwill tour into South America and Central America. And people were even more excited about aviation. And that really occurred here in San Diego as well. And the excitement about Lindbergh and aviation led to this need by the city fathers that there needed to be an airport. Aviation was going to grow. And so they pushed to get a bond measure passed, which passed with overwhelming support, which led to the creation of the San Diego Airport, which became known as Lindbergh Field. And in August 16th, 1928, the field opened, and everyone who was anyone in San Diego came out. Thousands of people enjoyed the opening presentations. There were flyovers, and that went to show just how popular aviation had become. Again, women in San Diego were still at the forefront, and local women had set altitude records. As you can see there, Marvel Crosland set an altitude record of 24,000 feet in the early 1930s, soon to be broken by Ruth Alexander, 27,000 feet, which is extremely high up there, considering at the time they were not in a pressurized aircraft as we are when we're going in a jetliner. So both these records were set above the skies of San Diego. So when we talk about World War II in San Diego, much like the rest of the country, the whole nation was put into the effort of the war. And I really like this photo because it kind of encapsulates what San Diego was during the wartime. This is the Consolidated Aircraft Factories Employment Office right at the start of the war. And what you could see above, that's netting. And what the netting is a way to camouflage the buildings, the factory, because right after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, there was a great fear that the same thing could happen anywhere on the West Coast, and that an attack could happen, and a likely target obviously would be the aerospace manufacturing companies. So they went about camouflaging the buildings so they wouldn't be as easily recognizable from the air. And so this shows that there was a fear that the war was really here, right in San Diego. But at the same time, the employment office shows that this was going to be an effort by the people, not only of San Diego, because we'll see that they came from all around to join the war effort and build aircraft, but it was going to be a sustained effort that eventually would lead to the growth of San Diego on unprecedented levels. So Consolidated Aircraft was originally from Buffalo, New York, and the company, much like Curtiss, was interested in flying boats. And much like Curtiss, he realized that the owner, Reuben H. Fleet, realized that the weather in Buffalo and flying boats aren't the best. You can only do so much, not all year round. But if you use San Diego and San Diego Bay, your research and development is going to be much more effective, and you could work all year round. And so in 1935, he opened up a Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego, and the original factory was at the location of where Lindbergh Field is today. And Consolidated, even before the war began, had a sense that it would be very important to the war effort. And two aircraft in particular, the PBY Catalina and the B-24 Liberator bomber, were in production before the time that the United States entered the war. And they were actually in use by England before the United States entered the war. The PBY would be known for its incredible range and its ability to hold large cargo, including large numbers of sailors. So the PBY was used for submarine reconnaissance, looking for submarines, bombing of submarines, general reconnaissance, and search and rescues, where it saved countless aircrew and sailors by being able to evacuate them from the water. The B-24 was an excellent bomber aircraft. It actually had a larger bomb payload than the seemingly more famous B-17, and perhaps was not as pretty as the B-17, looked a little more boxy, but it was a very, very effective aircraft. And thousands were built here in San Diego. Eventually, I think over 17,000 of the B-24 bomber were built. In addition to it being built in San Diego, there were plants in Fort Worth and in Michigan. But definitely, it was one of the mainstays here in San Diego. And with there's this growing demand for these aircraft, really, there were not enough people in San Diego with the skill or the desire to build the aircraft. So people from all around the country came to the region to work. And there are two notable things about this. One is the Rosie the Riveters, the famous women who came to work in the factories, Consolidated. Almost 50% of the workforce, these were women who trained and worked on the assembly lines, putting together the aircraft. What's also notable was that because of the large number of people needed to work at the factory, you needed a place to house them. So even before the war began, Reuben Fleet of Consolidated knew that there was going to be a demand for more housing. So this is why an area like Linda Vista was actually built originally for workers who were coming to Consolidated to have a place to stay. And you could see an early picture there of the area of Linda Vista. So the population grew incredibly during World War II, and many of the people who came to the area found jobs at Consolidated Aircraft, and the factory grew as well. There was the main factory was at where Lindbergh Field was, and a second factory was built just north of Lindbergh Field and could still be seen as the former SPAWAR, or SPAWAR. I think they're called NAV War now, naval bases by the 8 and the 5 split there. You can see those large buildings. That was the plant 2 of Consolidated built during the Second World War. Ryan was also very active during the Second World War. They were across, their main factory was kind of across the runway, closer to the bay. They had been in the area. T. Claude Ryan had restarted the factory and also continued flight training at Lindbergh Field in the 1930s. And with World War II, they ramped up production of primary trainers. The PT-22 was the most produced aircraft that they made. And in addition to that, they trained pilots for primary flying at Lindbergh Field, in Hemet, and in Arizona. They also had a flight school. And Ryan produced the Fireball, which was a really interesting aircraft that kind of got caught between times. It was a carrier-based airplane that had a piston-driven engine, but also a jet engine. And it just arrived too late in the war to see much combat. And then soon the fact that the jet engine, all jet aircraft would be more capable, put the Fireball as just a footnote in history, but it was built here in San Diego. And there were also other companies involved in the war effort here in San Diego. Roar was originally started out by the airport, and they made components. So they made, for example, the engine mounts for the B-24s, and they would be involved in the area for many, many years making components. And the Standard and Pacific parachute companies were in the area as well. The Pacific Parachute Company is really interesting because it was one of the few African American owned businesses in America that provided resources for the war. And they were located kind of near Petco Park, where Petco Park is now. And they made parts for parachutes. And so obviously during the Second World War, North Island was one of the most important bases on the West Coast and was a hotbed of activity throughout the war. And this image in the upper left shows shortly after the war just how large the naval aviation arm had become, and much of that happened here in San Diego. Moving on to the Cold War, Ryan and Consolidated stayed in business, and they were very, very successful with several projects. One thing that happened to the area, which happened with a lot of the similar companies, is the demand for the aircraft at the end of the war just shrunk dramatically. Obviously, you weren't fighting a war, so you didn't need thousands of aircraft produced. But that didn't keep the two main companies from being innovative and producing aircraft. So, for example, Ryan shifted to making unmanned aerial vehicles like the Firebee, that orange drone that was seen there. And these could be used for target practice, but eventually, as technology got better, they were used for reconnaissance as well. And today, we're definitely familiar with how important drones, or RPVs, which are remotely piloted vehicles, are to today's warfare. And during the time immediately after World War II through the 50s and 60s, Ryan really was the leader in this technology and developing this technology. Ryan also made the Navion, which was a commercial, not it was a general aviation aircraft, and that was used by the military as well. Consolidated found success in a variety of roles. They made the supersonic fighters like the F-102 and F-106. They made airliners like the 240 series, and the 880 and 990 series of jetliners. Not quite as successful as the Boeing 707 or the DC-8s of Douglas, but they were definitely purchased by several airlines. You see the B-36, that was actually produced in Fort Worth, but a lot of the design that went into the initial planning of it occurred in San Diego. So both these aircraft manufacturers had become very successful. A note about Consolidated: in 1943, they merged with Vultee Aircraft, and they started at that time being called Consolidated Vultee, and then were referred to as Convair and officially became Convair in the post-war period. So that's where the Convair designation comes from, Consolidated Vultee. And with a lot of aerospace companies, you have to try a lot of things. And you can see some of the aircraft that were produced by Ryan and Convair in the post-war area. Consolidated and then later Convair were always interested in the air car idea, and they experimented with making some. So when you hear about when are we going to get our air car, Consolidated had been doing this in the 1940s and 1950s. And another thing that both companies were interested in was short takeoff and landing and vertical takeoff and landing. You see there an aircraft made by Ryan that looked at being able to take off on very short runways. And both Ryan and Consolidated made aircraft that could take off and land vertically. The X-13 by Ryan and the Pogo by Convair. These were not used in production, but some of the ideas and lessons that were gathered from them would eventually be put into effect in today's aircraft and the Harrier aircraft that we're much more familiar with. Other ideas like the Sea Dart was a jet fighter that could land on the water, or the Weeby, which was actually a private undertaking by Convair engineers who formed the B Aviation company, which was a aircraft that you could lay on, which was at the time the smallest aircraft in the world. So even though a lot of these different ideas didn't go into production and are not household names, a lot of lessons that were learned were applied to aircraft that are around today. And San Diego really reached for the stars with the Atlas. Convair, after World War II into the 1950s, had been interested in rocket design and working on both an intercontinental ballistic missile and rockets that would be able to put satellites and later people into space. And this was the Atlas program, as it was called. And in the late 1950s, the Convair Astronautics Division was opened in Kearny Mesa. And this was a very, very successful undertaking. The Atlas missile was used for putting some of the first astronauts in space with Project Mercury. It was one of the first deployed ICBMs that would have been launched in case of a nuclear war. The Atlas Centaur was used to put satellites into space, and the Atlas family of lifting bodies is still around today, although not produced by Convair anymore, as Convair was sold to General Dynamics in the 1990s. it was considered a very successful project. It's interesting to note that the Houston Rockets at one time were the San Diego Rockets, and they were named after the Atlas missile. Just a little factoid. And we can't mention San Diego aviation history without Pacific Southwest Airlines. It was founded in 1949 and billed itself as the world's friendliest airline. It was initially called the Poor Sailors Airline by a lot of the people who flew it, because a lot of times sailors in San Diego would use the airline to fly home and visit their relatives. Start out very small with a few DC-3s, but gradually grew, and it became an iconic symbol with the smiles on the aircraft and the flight attendants who would wear very colorful outfits. And it became kind of the model of a friendly, low-cost airline. A lot of the lessons from Pacific Southwest Airlines were used by low-cost airlines about using friendly service and making it a nice experience. A lot of the airlines like Southwest today try to emulate that model. By 1987, it was purchased by US Air, but it was located here in San Diego. It's founded in San Diego and headquartered in San Diego. So today, San Diego is still in the forefront of aviation technology. Northrop Grumman is located in the area, probably most well known for the Global Hawk. Northrop Grumman had taken over Ryan and continued the legacy of making unmanned aerial vehicles. General Atomics is from the area, and they had designed the Predator, which is now being merged out, and more advanced models are taking over. But General Atomics is still one of the major players in the area with unmanned aerial vehicles. And North Island is still as important as ever for national defense. And Miramar at one time was one of the best known air stations, is now a Marine station. So San Diego really is still a key player. These are just some of the few aviation related companies that are around today. But the growth of San Diego can be so strongly attributed to aviation, both with the growth of the people and the economy of the area is really important. And then not only that, but the iconic movie Top Gun took place in Miramar and in San Diego, and kind of is the romantic view of all that's great about the aviation in San Diego. And number 2 came out, and that legacy is still alive. So that's what I got.